All right. It should be recording. Welcome to day 2 of the CISSP mentor program. We're going to be actually starting today with the actual details here. So just a welcome, we are looking at.
You want to
Is it
get the full screen again? You're showing up, I think.
I guess just your view.
Okay.
We'll see.
We had it full screen before.
That's because I didn't have the video going. All right. So today we're going through Domain 1, Security and Risk Management. There's a lot to cover tonight, so we are going to be going through this very quickly. When we're looking at this, you will see that, oh, here we go. You ready? We're going to let the journey begin. So we're going to highlight things that you need to know and kind of the, there, your glasses are broken.
You broke them.
Yep, that's what I do. We're going to be going very quickly through this. So we're going to be hitting on the things that you really need to be focused on for what's going to be in the exam. So this is where reading the book is going to fill in a lot of those gaps, but it'll help you understand exactly what those key points are. So when we're going through this, we're going to be talking about what the cornerstone security concepts are, legal and regulatory issues, security third parties, so vendor risk management. We need to know about ethics, security governance, access control, defensive categories and types, risk analysis, and types of attackers. So you need to learn and memorize these terms and know exactly what they are. So we're looking at the CIA triad. This is a cornerstone of the whole program. So we're talking about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confidentiality is preventing the unauthorized disclosure of information. So are we keeping our data secret? Integrity is ensuring that what we say is there, what that data is true, right? That people aren't modifying this and making unauthorized changes to it. And then availability is it available, right? So that's kind of like you hear about SLAs and uptime and things like that. So when people need access to it, can they get to it? And then we have to know identity. So we're looking at subject, which is an active entity, and then object, which is a passive, in this case, data file. So we'll go into these a little bit more in detail as we get through this. Everybody's writing madly, and I'm just going to keep clicking through. It's going to drive everyone crazy. So more terms and definitions. So again, this is where getting the slide deck afterwards and using it is going to be really helpful. We're looking at risk. So what is the likelihood of something happening and the impact if it did? So we're looking at threats and vulnerability. So what is the threat? And then how, what is that bad event? Maybe it's a hack or a ransomware. And then what is the vulnerability? What's the weakness that's going to be exploited? We need to know how to calculate annualized loss expectancy. So what is the cost of loss due to risk over a year? And there's several formulas for that. We'll go through that. But you'll need to know how to calculate annualized loss expectancy. Then safeguards or control. So again, what are we doing to put in place to try and mitigate or reduce risk? Total cost of ownership is the total cost of that safeguard or control. One of the things to remember is the cost of that safeguard should not outweigh the cost of the risk. Something important. So if your risk is a $5,000 impact and the solution to prevent that from happening is $20,000, that doesn't make sense, right? So we need to know that. Yes?
That's compared to the annualized loss expectancy, or is that like a 10-year outlook?
I would say annualized loss expectancy, right? So if you take that and you say, here's the risk, and then what that cost would be per year, figure that out. Yep. And then ROI, so the return on investment. So if we spend this money, what is our return on that investment? And that's a really difficult one to determine for security. A lot of people just see security and expenses as a cost center, right? It's very hard to show that return on investment. All right, so the definition of information security, you will need to know this. So it is managing confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information using administrative, physical, and technical controls. Okay, a lot of times we see, and it says that it's overemphasizing technical controls. but it's all three of those. We need to have administrative, physical, and technical to put together a strong program, right? So you need to know and understand that protecting the CIA triad using administrative, physical, and technical controls. And there is your CIA triad. So they're all even, right? We want to make sure that we've got a balance. So balance is critical. The opposite of the CIA triad is bad. So disclosure, alteration, or destruction. So if you have any of those three things, you have a disclosure, that triad is out of bounds. You've got an issue, right? If you have alteration to it, you can no longer ensure the integrity of that data. Or if it's been destroyed, it's no longer available. So you just need to make sure you understand the opposite to the CIA is DAD. So when we're talking about confidentiality, we're looking at preventing unauthorized access, disclosure, or read access, right? Keeping data secret. It really comes back to need to know. So if we have data that we've classified or that we have and said only certain people are allowed to have access to this, are we only allowing those people to have that access? Right? So we talk about data classification, internal, public, or confidential. Well, if it's internal, we need to make sure that only internal people have it. The general public doesn't. That's ensuring that confidentiality piece. When we look at integrity, again, it's preventing that unauthorized modification of the data. So we're looking at data integrity and system integrity. There's like a lot of, software out there that'll watch file integrity, right? If the file changes, it'll alert you. That's what we're looking for here is integrity. Good example, you want integrity in your bank statement or in your bank account. So the money that it says you have, you have. Right? If you didn't have that integrity, if you couldn't guarantee that that was accurate, that somebody hadn't modified it, that's an issue. So back. Let's see.
I just sent the message to Peter. He's gonna check with the.
All right. So I apologize for everyone online. We're using.
Oh, she said it's back on there.
Yeah, I'm using my hotspot on my phone, so we are kind of limited. We've apparently lost internet at the office because why not?
Availability.
I know, right? All right. Well, hopefully this will hold out. We'll see. So availability is ensuring data is available when needed, which apparently our internet is failing at right now. So is Lori saying that you can see and hear me right now? Okay. All right. So again, I don't know where it left off, but again, confidentiality and integrity do compete with availability, right? So you want everything available, but then you have to lock it down because of the need to know point of that. So this is a big point. Information security is about risk management and not risk elimination. You cannot eliminate all your risk. What you want to do is manage your risk and try to get it to an acceptable level. What is that level? Well, that's up to the organization to decide. But to determine your risk, what is the most important or critical asset? So we have to know an asset inventory and figure out what is the business impact if those assets are not available. So we're using the safeguards, those controls to protect assets and mitigate, again, not eliminate. We're going to mitigate risk. And then risk tolerance is that amount of risk the business is willing to tolerate or accept. So what we're looking at here is that business impact analysis and having a risk management program in place. So do we know what is our risk tolerance? What are we willing to do? A good example of this would be maybe an IT data center. If you have, do you have redundant ISPs coming in, right? For us, apparently we do not. That's fine. We did not. We did a risk analysis on this and said, you know what? The reality is we can do most of our work remotely. It's not worth the cost of an additional, bringing in an additional line versus the impact of that line of this main internet provider going down. Right? I've got tethering on my phone, so we're back up. I am functional. So we did a risk analysis and determined our tolerance was, you know what? We're okay if it goes down for a little bit because people can go home, work remotely, or they can use their mobile hotspot tether to that. So what is that risk tolerance? That's something that each organization has to determine for themselves. Privacy. So it's part of information security. This is often a separate issue, right? When we're looking at privacy, there's no definition of privacy. Okay, it's part of it. So it's really goes back to like need to know, right? We want to keep the privacy of that information. We want to make sure that those that don't need access to it don't have it, right? Comes back to kind of it's within confidentiality. And so a good example, medical records only should be need to know because there is a privacy aspect to that. We don't want everybody in the hospital having access to the medical records. We should only have the specific department or the staff that's assigned to that patient having access to those records. So then we have, on top of that CIA triad, we have identity and authentication, authorization, and accountability. So identity, that's just saying, here's who I am, right? This is that username. In this case, I'm Brad. I'm identifying myself to you. That doesn't verify anything. Anybody could come up and say, hi, I'm Brad. So we're just saying who I am. We're just claiming and saying that. We then turn around and say authentication. That's providing proof of who you are. So a password, that's the biggest usually way we prove authentication. Two-factor authentication, biometrics, an ID card, right? That's when you're now going from I'm identifying myself to I'm authenticating who I actually am. So when we look at authentication, right, there's three types, and this is where we get into that multi-factor. Something you know, and you need to know this. Anything in those orange in the main parts, those are really kind of the key points to focus on and make sure you understand. So when we look at authentication, again, it's something you know, something you have, or something you are. Again, know is passwords, pins, things like that. Things are in your brain. Have, again, a two-factor token, your phone with the multi-factor app on it, or something you are. So biometrics, fingerprint, facial recognition, the retina scans. So using any two of these are considered strong authentication, so multi-factor. So if you use a password with a token, right, something you know, something you have. You can do something you have, something you are. You want to have two or more of those, and that's when you get into what we call multi-factor authentication. Good example, username is identification and password is your authentication, okay? Pretty straightforward. Everybody, I would assume a lot of people here, you already know that, but we want to make sure you actually understand those differences. They will test you on this pretty extensively in the exam. So once a subject has been identified and authenticated, that's when you go through authorization. So that's what are we allowed to do? What am I authorized to do on the system now that I've said, hey, this is who I am, and I've proven that it is who I am. Now what can I do when I get in? And that's what authorization is. Again, big point, just because you've been authorized to a system doesn't mean you should have access to that, or they should be able to do something, right? So we still need to know principle still applies on this. So just because I can log into a server, let's say a file server, I've identified myself, I've verified, I've authenticated using my password, it says, yep, you're authorized to view this file server. That doesn't mean I need access to everything on that file server, right? What should I have access to? So we need to really do focus on that principle of need to know, right? We want to keep it least privilege. Now, we do talk about least privilege here. They're very similar. Least privilege is tied to rights, what you can do with and in the system, and then need to know is tied to the information, what you can do with the information. So very, very similar. The concepts are the same. You just need to know if you have least privilege, it's rights, it's tied to rights. If you're saying need to know, it's tied to what are you able to do with that information. So a violation of least privilege can easily violate the need to know principle, right? So that scares me, that little quote there. 30% of respondents to the survey admitted to having no policy in place for managing administrator access. Can't tell you how many places we've gone and seen where everybody on the help desk is admitted domain admin, and that's their only account, right? Just because they're identified and authenticated doesn't mean that that's the level of access they should be having. So we still want to focus on going with least privilege for your rights, only use what you have to, and then need to know you should only have access to, when you see that information, only what you actually need to see. All right, we are 20 slides in. I'm already seeing people go, slow down. So big piece here, so subjects and objects. This is the one that's kind of tricky, right? Subject is an active entity, object is a passive entity, but an entity can be a subject in one instance and an object in another. What would be a good example of this? You have an application on your computer, whatever it is, Internet Explorer, Chrome, whatever. The actual executable would be an object when it's not running. When it's sitting on your desktop, it is an object. When Chrome or Internet Explorer, whatever that application is, when it's actually running and modifying and active, it then becomes a subject, right? So you need to be able to tell and understand what's the difference between a subject and an object. Subject is active, object is passive. You're going to get questions on this on the exam. The easiest way to answer those, because they're going to have four answers, and two of them will be correct for, they're looking for the answer is it's a subject, right? So two of them will be correct for an object, two will be correct for a subject. Easiest way to understand it is read the question and determine, is what they're asking for, is it a subject or an object? Then when you look at those questions or the answers, you're going to very quickly be able to go, oh wait, it's not those two, because they're looking at it as a subject or an object, whatever it is. Yes.
Do you have an example question where we can use that trick?
There will be quizzes at the next class.
Okay. Will you be sure to talk about?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good example though. So another one might be, a script that modifies a database. It would be an object when it's not running, when it's just sitting there in the waiting to be run. But when it's actually executing and modifying the database, it then becomes a subject. right? So it's an object when it's not running, and then it becomes a subject when it's running, and the database is the object. Really confusing. But once you actually start looking at it and thinking about it and get used to it, go through a couple of examples. There are actually some good examples in the book for that as well. Once it kind of clicks, it makes sense. But again, it is very testable. They will make sure you understand the difference. Yes.
Would it be unfair to categorize it like the difference between RAM and ROM?
Brad,
Yeah.
please repeat the question.
Yeah, okay, yeah, good, thank you. Sorry. The question was, would it be fair to classify it as the difference between RAM and ROM? And no, I don't think so, because when you're looking at it, it's really looking at it as a paper or a database table. That's what an object would be. It is just sitting there not doing anything, right? But it could be modified in some way versus now we're actually doing the modification. Yeah, that's true. That's a good question. I don't think I've never been asked that before. It's a good question. I don't know where Evan is. What do you think, Robert?
When you're accessing ROM, though, you're still doing something.
Right.
I don't know what other people think.
I would say ROM might be another one where it would be both, right? So if you're not actually accessing it at the time, it would be the object. But then when it's actually executing whatever is in it to do, that's what it would become a subject.
Right.
There you go. Person's a person's a subject, a corpse is an object. That's a different way of putting it, but yes. And we'll go through this again. This is a tough one, right? So what we'll do is, remember, next week, come through, make sure you have some questions. We'll go through a recap on this and have some quizzes and have some examples, especially now we know kind of where people struggle as we go through this.
Very quick, see, I don't know what other people think, but I think of a book not doing anything until you crack it open.
Yeah.
Like that. So
Yeah.
Until you open the book,
so
it's an object.
So think of it as a book.
Open, start reading it.
Yeah. Yeah. Think of a book. So it's just sitting there.
But there's interaction.
Right.
So, and I think this is one of those words that's, if you were in Europe or some other country, subject and
yeah,
object.
But for the purposes of the exam, what we want to focus on is that the subject is active, object is passive. I think once we go through the test questions next week as well, I'll make sure we get one in there. Excuse me. That'll really kind of it'll register a little bit better when we actually see that question that relates to it a little bit more. Okay. So again, I think for my the way it clicked for me was the application sitting there on my desktop was an object, and then once I clicked it and ran it, it became a subject. Right. So to me, that's what makes sense. I know that doesn't work for everyone. And
question from online has to do with the quizzes. Will they be part of the slide deck?
Yeah, they'll be part of the slide deck, and then we'll do them like as online poll, so the people online will have a chance to answer as well. So, but yeah, they'll be part of the slide deck. So due care and due diligence. Really, what we're looking for is what you're doing reasonable, right? So are you conducting an information security risk assessment? If you're not, are you doing your due care, due diligence, right? Hey, can you text Peter and check, see if your internet's back?
I'm on.
Oh, you're on that?
I'm in my hotspot.
All right. He texted me while I'm teaching. Thank you, Peter. Are we making logical risk-based information security decisions, or are we just going, yeah, you know what, I think that's right? Or are we doing an actual assessment and making a determination? Is not knowing what your most significant risk is that conducting due care, due diligence? Is that being reasonable? Is ignorance a valid excuse? It's not. So, down there. Somehow we duplicated it. So there's only 79 slides. Winning. All right. So again, these are the cornerstones. This is that right there, what we just went through, those 20, 25 slides. That is the cornerstone of everything we're going to build off of here. So as long as we have that core fundamental understanding, a lot of this builds off of it. So you need to have these locked down, everything we just went through. So when you get that slides, just make sure you understand all that. I'll make sure I clean up that extra slide. I'll blame Evan because he's not here. I don't know if he's online or not, but I'll blame Evan. And then if I messed up and he was here, I'd blame him because he was here. So legal and regulatory issues. We do need to know about the legal systems out there, regulatory systems. We need to know that stuff. You will be tested on it. So when we look at this, 4 major legal systems covered: civil law, common law, religious, and customary law. Okay, these are different around the world, and you need to understand that wherever you're at, that's the legal system you're under. So you need, if you're practicing in, in the US, in the UK, in Thailand, in Japan, whatever their legal system is, that's what you're going to be subjective to. So we need to know that. Excuse me. We will go through what the differences are on these. Yes. Internet is back up. You can let Peter know the internet's back up. I'm going to try and let this run so I don't drop off of the webinar again.
Is it also worth noting that wherever you are, it's also wherever your data is?
And wherever your data is, that's a good point. So wherever you are and wherever your data is, that's what the law, yeah, that's a good point. So when we look at civil law, this is the most common legal system throughout the world. So we're looking at codified laws, statutes. We've got them written out, but we're not looking at judicial precedent, right? So we're looking at the legislative branch creating the laws, but they don't consider judicial precedent when they're doing this. That's the most common. So then we have common law, and this is what we're all mostly familiar with. This is in the US, Canada, UK, and the others. What you'll notice is those are all former British colonies, right? So it started in the UK with common law, and those inherited it, I guess. This is the most likely legal system to be referred to in the exam, right? So when you were looking at the exam, just when you're taking it, understand that it most likely is referring to common law. So again, this is codified laws or statutes, very similar. However, then we have a weight is given to judicial precedent and outcome from previous case. And you can have those interpretations of laws change over time. What's a good example of that? Well, it's the Supreme Court changing laws, understanding what that precedent is right here in the US. So as you have judges interpret what those laws mean, that judicial precedent then can change and kind of understand, clarify what, or I guess clarify what the meaning of that law was. Is it back down? That's why I didn't change over. Risk management, not worth the risk. I'm betting my phone battery doesn't die. So here we go. Common law is actually made up of 3 different. What's that?
USB charger.
Oh, thank you. I will do that. I will charge that up real quick. Now my computer battery will die. Right? I know. So I'm not typing any keys. Yeah, that's all right. I know who he is. I've got all his contact info. I've got people here. Anyway, so within common law, you've got civil law, criminal law, and administrative laws. And we're going to go through those a little bit more. But you notice, right, most common is civil law, and common law incorporates civil law into it. So when you learn common law, you are going to learn what civil law is, but you just need to know that there are 3 parts of common law. Maybe. All right, now my clicker battery died. Man. All right, so in common law, we talked about the 3. Criminal law, we're going to talk about. This is where we're looking at the victim is society, right? So this is where crimes, this is where punishment is jail, the death penalty, and there are financial crimes as well, right? So when we look at this, the way to remember criminal law, right, handcuffs. Kind of an easy way to remember that. So we look at civil law. This is typically between private parties. This is tort law, so you're looking at damages where they're financial, right? Statutory, you need to understand that what statutory, compensatory, and punitive damages are. So statutory would be, the law states if this happens, here's the fine, right? It's black and white. Compensatory is for awarding it. So you get into a car accident, and you're given compensatory damages. This is you're being compensated for your injuries or for your loss. And then punitive is really punishment, right? You're trying to prevent people and discourage people from behaving in this way in the future.
Would that be like jail?
For civil law, no. This would be like, you might have like a statutory damages of $1,000, and then the jury awards punitive damages of $10,000. Or right, it happened in McDonald's case way back where the woman poured the scalding hot coffee on herself, and they got punitive damages in the millions of dollars. It's meant to discourage and penalize that behavior. So, no, it's not working. I don't know. I put it. So again, civil law, again, it's in court, right? We're in court, but we're looking at monetary damages for the most part. It's kind of an easy way to remember it. So criminal law, handcuffs; civil law, we're looking at monetary damages. And then lastly, we're looking at administrative law. So this is the laws enacted by governmental agencies. So this is what Congress and House and Senate put together. That's kind of an easy way. So then we look at FCC regulations, HIPAA, kind of you hear about the new laws, the tax law or tax act that was just passed, right? That is administrative law.
What does that mean? Very little recourse.
You can't argue with them. So if the IRS comes after you with administrative law, you can argue and go against them, but really what defense are you going to have, right? So if they come after you for a HIPAA violation, they're going to come after you. You can't really push that back and have any way of recovering damages in that case. They're coming after you with a lot of backing and oomph. So it's very hard to go back and push back against. Very costly. So again, administrative, think of the government. Does that make sense for the three different types of laws? All right, we'll find out next week in the quiz. All right, we'll go through a couple. Okay, so we're looking at legal and regulatory issues, so we need to know what liability is. So we're looking at who is being held accountable and who are we going to blame, right? Who is liable for the accident? Who's at fault? Who's going to be held responsible and have to pay out? Pretty common. A lot of this, again, goes back to prudent man rule. Anybody heard of the prudent man rule, right? When you look at this for due care, due diligence, are you doing what a prudent man would do? Are you doing what others in your industry, what the norm is? So if everybody in the industry is doing risk assessments and vulnerability scanning, and you're not doing anything and just hoping for the best, you're not going to fall within that prudent man rule, right? You've got to know what's going on, and are you doing, if somebody were to look at that, would they consider that to be what a prudent person would be doing? So again, there you go. Liability, the state of being responsible for something. So when we look at an issue, a breach, who's liable for that breach? Well, who are we going to blame? Is really what that comes down to. Who's at fault? Who's going to pay for it? We're going to look at legal aspects of investigations. This is really important if you do any sort of forensics. We got to know this. They do test on this on the exam. So there's multiple types of evidence, and there is a weighting to those types of evidence. We'll go through those here in a second. But you need to make sure what you need to know about evidence, those points: relevant, authentic, accurate, complete, and convincing. Okay, so when you have evidence, you need to know that it needs to be those things. It'll remember it'll say which of these is the most important, and it'd be one of those and 4 that don't make sense, or 3 questions or 3 answers that don't apply, and then it'll say it needs to be relevant. It needs, so maybe it would be like timely and something else. That's not true, right? We want it to be relevant, accurate, authentic, complete, and convincing. And we'll go through this here in a little bit more. So what is real evidence? We're looking at tangible physical things, right? So this might be, right, the computer, the hard drive, the physical part, papers, shoes, right? Physical objects. That's what we're looking at with real evidence. The data on a hard drive, that is not real evidence. The hard drive itself, that's the real evidence. When we look at direct evidence, that's testimony, right? First-hand witness, using one of those, one or more of the 5 senses. So this would be, where you get the in that testimony where that says, yes, I saw Eric do that. I heard Eric on the phone saying this. Right? That would be first direct evidence, first-hand witness, first-hand testimony of that. Yes.
What if you saw it in the logs what he was doing?
That would be circumstantial evidence, right? So it establishes the circumstances related to it, but that alone is not. Can you prove that his credentials were not stolen and then his credentials were used and that's what you saw in the logs? Now it could be used to back it up. I heard Eric say he was going to do this. I looked at the logs and found where his account did that, what I heard him say. So it's going to back up and support that direct evidence, right? Yeah, they're totally on purpose too, right? Corroborative, could also, I guess it would be corroborative evidence to strengthen a fact or element of a case. So additional support, but cannot establish a fact on its own. That could be one where I saw Eric walking into the hotel at 9 o'clock the other night. That on its own, that doesn't mean anything. I heard Eric's, and then you could go with maybe somebody having firsthand evidence of saying, Eric said he was going to rob that hotel tomorrow night. And then you have somebody else go, hey, I saw Eric walk into the hotel last night. Now you're strengthening that case. You're welcome, Eric.
I feel like I shouldn't rob my hotel tonight now.
Probably not a good idea. And then hearsay, so that'd be your secondhand evidence considered inadmissible in court. We will go through the rules here. There is an exception, Rule 803. You will need to know that there is an exception to that. Hearsay would be, Brittany told me that Eric did this. That's not going to be enough, right? That's secondhand information at that point. Does that make sense? Any questions online with that? I'll have to pick on somebody else now. So hearsay evidence, this is important to understand, right? General admissibility is defined in Rule 802 of the Federal Rules of Evidence. You will need to know what hearsay evidence is, Federal Rule 802, but there are other rules, 803 and 804, that are exceptions because, of course, there are. So there's your business and computer-generated logs are generally considered hearsay. So I guess I was wrong.
Really?
Apparently. So I need Evan here for this. Rule 803 provides the admissibility made at or near the time by or from information transmitted by a person with knowledge, if kept in course of regular conducted business activity. It was a regular practice of that business activity to take memorandum, report, record, or data compilation. I'd say this would be where you get with the contemporaneous notes from like the FBI, where they make their notes immediately after. That would be an exception to hearsay rule. Right. So again, if you're doing things, another one, right, in the regular practice of the business activity. So I'm trying to think of a good example of that. If they're, I'm drawing a blank. I'll have to come back to that. We'll come up with some. I just completely drew a blank. I think the contemporaneous notes is a good example of that, though, right? Where this is their regular activity, is they will take their notes immediately after the meeting because you can't do it in the meeting, but there's considered to be acceptable into court. Whereas if I took notes after a meeting, that would just be hearsay. I don't have that level of
Similarly,
truth.
if you pulled the logs only after you became aware of an incident and you weren't customarily pulling logs and analyzing them on a regular basis, that's when it's still considered hearsay.
Thank you. That's a great, thank you. I'm glad you said that. So, yeah, pulling logs only after an evidence or after an incident would be hearsay. But if you routinely, every day we check the logs at 8 a.m. and you can prove that every day you pull those logs and you look through them every day, that would be part of your regular practice.
So likewise, if you were using like a SIEM system to service exceptions, would that also cover it?
What a SIEM solution fall under that? I don't know.
Was that part of your regular practice to review?
It would be, yeah, it would be, are you reviewing?
The service technician and the security analyst who's analyzing the SIM logs, that really 3 admissibility, that's a regular routine.
Yeah, so if you have that solution but you don't regularly review it, that wouldn't qualify. But if you have somebody that gets that report every single day and they track that, yes, I looked at the logs this day, I found these exceptions or whatever, and you can prove that that is part of that regular business activity. That's a great example. Thank you for helping me out there. Again, here's the evidence. We always preserve the original, create a binary copy, conduct an investigation using the copy, not the original, right? If we're doing a forensic investigation, we never want to use the original hard drive, the original system. We want to make a copy using a binary copy and then set that original away in a safe, locked, controlled location and do the investigation against the copy. Rule 1001 is the admissibility of binary disk and physical memory images. We need to be able to show that they reflect the data accurately and is quote unquote an original. So if you're making that binary copy, it is a bit by bit copy of the original. And if we investigate the original, there's the potential to change it and taint that evidence, right? So we want to make a bit by bit copy, a binary copy, use that, and that would then become admissible. And then you got to be aware that opposing counsel is going to question the validity of any data used in an investigation. One of the things, I don't remember if it's on here, that we talk about with doing incident investigation, it's going to take longer to document what you've done than actually doing it. If it's not taking you longer to document what you're doing than to do it, you're doing it wrong. Every single thing you do, it needs to be documented. I did this at this time, I did this at this time, I did this at this time, and then go and do it. And it's a hassle, takes forever, but that is the way we have to do it for it to be a kind of a solid investigation. Best evidence rule. So courts prefer best evidence possible. Again, it goes back to evidence should always be relevant, authentic, accurate, complete, and convincing. Remember, direct evidence will always be best evidence. So if you get in there and it says which of these is the best evidence, it's direct evidence. So it'll say, the 4 types. I'm going to go back here, right? Oop, too far. So if you've got, these 5 types of evidence, right? This is we want to know direct is best, right? So
Direct is best.
direct evidence is always best.
So a person's testimony matters more than
Physical.
evidence.
I mean, really.
Well, so keep in mind, the data is not the real evidence, right? So real evidence is the hard drive. That doesn't necessarily prove anything. The direct evidence would be the data on that hard drive. That's what's going to prove something. Right? That make sense? It's a good question. Nope, too far. That's a chain of custody. Secondary evidence. So this is where it's very common in the computer. So that's the copies versus originals, logs, or like that SIM report where it's a compilation. It's not every log. It's pulled out and kind of discarded the noise. That'd be secondary evidence. And then we need to have a chain of custody form, right? Remember, so prosecuting computer crimes is very hard. This is a very long, tedious process, right? You got to understand defense counsel is going to call every single piece and every step into question and try and discredit it.
So in a case where you get a letter from Comcast that says somebody in your organization has been downloading pirated movies.
Mhm.
The best that they have is hearsay evidence on that. is
They're
what it sounds
saying,
like.
yeah, they're seeing internet traffic that shows traffic to whatever that site would be. Doesn't necessarily prove it was somebody in your organization. Could be, you know, a hijacker or somebody on Wi-Fi that has gotten in. So there's a chain of custody form, right? We need to know all this information. So every time there's a handoff, it needs to be documented in the chain of custody form. Who collected it, the date, time. I'm gonna hand it off to Brittany. We're both gonna sign it and say that she now has chain of custody. Then it goes into the evidence locker or wherever it is, and she would sign off on it that I put it in here at this date and time. The next time somebody goes in there, that's the last that should be on there. Anybody takes it out, they need to sign it out, sign it back in. So anytime there's a transfer, that needs to be documented. Yes.
Will you just make sure that you're repeating all questions? And
Oh, yeah, sorry. I forgot it's on my computer audio, so it's definitely not picking up everything. Sorry. I like to make the people online guess.
Well, I've got a
And
intense course.
yeah. So evidence integrity, right? We just said prosecuting these crimes is very difficult, right? The quality of the evidence is going to be challenged in court, or you need to assume it's going to be, right? You need to understand that everything you do, everything you present, the defense is going to question everything you present. Integrity of that data. This is what it is, right? Hashes, having a binary to be able to go and then saving that original so that they could compare hashes and say, okay, this is the same. It's very important. So the checksums that occurs, right? So what's happening? What changes are we making as we go? We need to be able to record that and have that information. So then we use, you know, the one-way hashes. So MD5, SHA-1, and then Evan's pro tip, MD5 in practice is weak and not preferred, so don't use it. But really, we're just showing when we look at it, we compare these two things, they have the same hash, right? The endpoint, the end result is the same. So we can prove that we haven't altered it or and preserve the integrity of it. All right, so we need to know Fourth Amendment is protecting citizens from unreasonable search and seizure. You'll need to know that. In all cases, the court makes that determination if the evidence was obtained legally. So you're gonna present your evidence, they're gonna challenge it. The court is the one that ultimately is gonna make that final ruling on is this admissible or not. Law enforcement does need a search warrant issued by a judge. There are some exceptions to that, so plain sight. So if they're walking by your car and you've got, you know, a baggie of marijuana on it and it's still illegal, well, that's going to be a problem, right? So if they could see it in plain sight, they don't have to go to any extraordinary measures. That's going to be a problem. You know, so public checkpoints, so DUI checkpoints, border crossings, right? These have been accepted as we don't need a warrant to obtain that evidence at that time. If there's exigent circumstances, so that's that immediate threat to life. So domestic abuse, and somebody calls and then the line goes dead and they get to the house and they're hearing screaming or whatever, they can go in without a search warrant, right? They consider it and say, hey, I thought somebody's life was in danger. And then if they find something in that case, it would then be considered typically admissible. Excuse me. These only apply to law enforcement and those operating under the color of the law. So you just need to know Title 18. We just need to know if they're operating under color of the law. So law enforcement, color of the law. So, you know, Border Patrol, sheriffs, police, things like that. So that would be the case. One thing to very much understand there at the bottom, if you're working with law enforcement and they say, hey, I need you to do this for me, that now means you could be working under the color of the law, which means you have to comply with the Fourth Amendment. Hey, Eric, can you do me a favor? Can you go in there and see if Peter has something on his desk that, you know, that I'm looking for? Or if I'm law enforcement and Eric acts on my behalf, is he following that Fourth Amendment for unreasonable search and seizure? So you need to be very careful if you do act on behalf of law enforcement that you are not going to fall under that requirement. Does that make sense?
What if you're abused?
You say, I need a search warrant. What are they going to, if you're helping them, right? I can't tell you what law enforcement would do. Just be aware of if you do act on their behalf, you could then fall under color of the law. Last part there, if law enforcement is not involved, a search warrant is not required. So at that point, if we're doing an internal investigation, right, within the organization, and I know I'm at a different location as Eric, and I say, hey, Eric, I need you to go check so-and-so's office for, for whatever evidence, that's no longer worried about a search warrant. We're not worried about a search warrant at that point. This is a tricky one, entrapment and enticement. Very similar. I grew up in DC and had Marion Barry. I grew up around that. That was a big one. So entrapment is persuading someone to commit a crime they would not have had any intent to commit. So that's a valid legal defense, right? That's where they're saying, hey, why don't you go steal that, right? Or they're really going to talk you into doing something illegal that you never would have done. Versus enticement is saying, I'm going to leave this bike out unlocked and catch the bike thief that's going to grab it, right? So that'd be a good example is, hey, go steal that bike versus I'm just going to leave it there unlocked and see who takes it. A good example from an IT type perspective is honeypots, right? People have gotten in trouble for that because it's a really kind of a sticky situation. Get it? All right, sorry. Right, so you're setting out a system that maybe is kind of, it's very enticing, right? It doesn't have patches. Maybe it's publishing itself as a certain name that would indicate that it has accessibility or has sensitive information that would be worth something. Well, are you saying, hey, this is here, somebody going to access something on that honeypot that normally they wouldn't have, but they just kind of go, oh, hey, look, I can see this stuff. Or versus we're trying to trap, the pen tester or the hacker and attract him to our honeypot versus the really sensitive information. So, typically we don't see a lot of honeypots anymore out there, I don't think. I haven't heard of anybody using them in quite a while. Yeah. We need to know the difference between trademarks and service marks. So trademarks, you got the circle R and the TM. So it's the creation of the distinguishing brand, right? So in this case, we have our FISA, which is trademark, and the FISA-SCORE, which is a registered trademark. We're looking at this as names, logos, symbols, or images, right? So trademark, the TM, that could be used by anybody, right? It's an unregistered trademark. We're just saying, this is ours, we use this. A registered trademark is with the Patent and Trademark Office. So we've applied for this, and we are the only ones who can use it. We can defend that. Service mark would be used to brand a service. Well, I just had a good example. I was going through this and had a really good example for a service mark. Man, I'll think of it after the class, and that'll be great. Want to know intellectual property, trademarks, and service marks. So Coke Classic, that is a registered trademark, right? We can't use that without having somebody using it. Versus, oh, there you go, create the good, a service mark, right? Here's our service, AARP is we're create the good, whatever that might be. That is a service mark for that service. So trademarks are going to be looking at, again, logos, phrases, names, words, things like that, images. And we need to know the difference, just to be clear, maybe. You do need to know the difference between the circle R, the registered trademark, and then the TM, the trademark. Patents, this is a legal monopoly for the patent holder. You have to apply for it. You have to prove that it is, again, novel and unique. Patents are good for 20 years. A lot of times with this would be drugs, right? That's a big one. You work and you patent the drug. You're the only one who can create that drug for 20 years. After that patent is expired, anybody can do it. So again, I think drug is probably the easiest way to explain that, right? So the drug company goes through and does all the research, discovers a new drug, they patent it, they have a monopoly on that drug for 20 years. They're the only ones. That's where they're going to recoup the cost of coming up and inventing it or discovering it. After that time is up, that's when you see the generics come in. That's why you see a lot of times drug companies go, towards the end of it, they'll come up with a new version of their drug, and it's really just a combination or slightly different formulation. Well, it's new, it's different. Now they can do just that new version for another 20 years, where the old version is now open to generic. Copyrights. So software is under copyright law. DVDs, movies, books, those are under copyright. Fair sale allows anybody to buy it and then turn around and sell it to someone else, right? To sell that software. So if I buy a CD, because I'm stuck in, 10 years ago or whatever, but I want to turn it, or like maybe a record, I'm into vinyl, right? So I buy that. I can turn around and sell it to somebody else later. That is fair use or fair sale. I'm sorry?
Isn't that supposed to be first sale? Or first sale?
Oh, you know what? Yeah, you're right. First, and then fair use. First sale, fair use. Yeah. I'll blame Evan.
Not me.
Eric's no. You're right. It should be first sale and then fair use. Duplication without the consent of the copyright holder. So fair use would be a good one. Was the music is in the background of that YouTube video of the kid dancing. It's not the point of it. It's just in the back. That's fair use, right? Another one would be transformative or for newsworthy reasons, right? So if you're using something but you're transforming the purpose of it, you're commenting on it, that would be fair use. Yeah. Yeah, satire. Yeah. Now you don't need to go into that in depth. You don't need to know what the different types of fair use are. You just need to know it allows for it if it's under like transformative use. Then licensing, that's that contract between the consumer and the provider. So end user license agreements. Pretty straightforward on that. Everyone's very familiar with, not having read through that 700-page EULA to use it. Although FTC just came out recently this week with saying that the warranty void if removed stickers are not valid. So that's kind of cool.
Is a gift fair use?
Is a gift, that would go under first sale, right? So you buy it and then gift it to someone else.
I know, gift.
Oh,
Yeah,
a gift. Oh. Jeff. Yeah, Jeff. I think, I guess it depends on how it is. I don't know the exact, there's probably a time limit and I just don't remember and know exactly what that is. You can use a piece of it and that would be considered, fair use, but you couldn't maybe use a 10-second clip versus, the entire 20 minutes or something. I will say in the book, it does go into a little bit more detail on that, right? So again, we really are focusing on kind of the high level. Here's what you have to study and what you need to know versus going super deep into every single one, just from a time perspective. Yes?
You probably will be covering more of these in depth, but there's a lot of laws with a lot of years. You need to know the specific years.
Yes. Yeah, so the question was, do we need to know laws and years, and do we need to know years? So yes, if you see, that's a good point. So if you see, really, so what I'll say is this, what you see on these slides, if you see a date on there or a name of an act or a law, you need to know that information, okay? So Copyright Act of 1976 for fair use. That would be important to know. Are you going to get tested on it? Maybe, maybe not, but it's important to know that. And we will be going through some of the laws, and you'll see that here shortly. So copyrights, these are implied, there's an implied copyright on all artistic works. You can file for a registered copyright at the Copyright Office. So you do have to know, just know that there is an implied copyright on all artistic works. So if you create something artistic, art, there is a copyright already implied that you can't, that it cannot be duplicated or used without your permission. Then you get a registered copyright, which gives you a little bit more enforceability for that. And when you get a registered copyright, it is 70 years after the death of the author, which keeps getting extended, which I believe kind of somehow coincides with the death of Walt Disney. Yeah, kind of strange. I won't say that for sure, but I believe there is some sort of coincidence there. A corporate copyright is 95 years after the first publication or 120 years after creation, whichever comes first. So if you get a corporate copyright, you're good on that for quite a while. Just you need to know the difference between the registered copyright, 70 years, corporate copyright, 95 years after first publication, 120 years after creation, whichever comes first. So you could corporate copyright something and not publish it, you know, for 30 years. Well, you only get 120 from that from the copyright date. Trade secrets. This is the secret sauce, right? So the Coke recipe, KFC, the Colonel Special recipe, or secret recipe, whatever that is, the secret blend of spices. This is going to be business proprietary information. You need to actively protect trade secrets. So that's why you see, you know, there was that story where somebody got turned, the Coke recipe turned over to them, and they went to it, right? They're very protective of that recipe because they have to actively protect it. So this is what makes you special as an organization, that company special. What is that? What is their secret sauce that nobody else has? And again, you just need to know, you know, trade secret is a secret sauce. It has to be actively protected. If they don't take reasonable steps, it is assumed that there is no competitive advantage, so it loses that trade secret. That's why you see people really being very aggressive with protecting that information.
It's actually just 1,000 miles.
So you say. The comment was it's actually just Thousand Island dressing.
I'm talking about Big Mac.
That's the Big Macs. So what are some attacks against intellectual property, right? So it's piracy, the cyber squatting, counterfeiting, and then dilution, which it's kind of funny. That's not an attack, but that's when the name becomes so synonymous with the product. It doesn't matter who actually makes it. It's called by that name, right? Band-Aid, Kleenex, Xerox for a while, right? Copies. I'm going to Google that.
They were not happy with that. For sure.
Yeah. You know, there's so many examples of that out there, right? You know, Q-tips. I mean, it's cotton swabs, but everybody says it's the Q-tip, right? So it's when your product becomes so synonymous with or your name becomes synonymous with it, it loses that kind of that special meaning. So look at that. Where'd it go? There it is. Right. So that would be some attacks where it's pirated in China, or right, UTIB, right, cyber squatting. So you're looking at, you know, maybe common misspellings of the site's name. So they would be an attack against that brand. It's the brand. So privacy, we need to know it's the confidentiality of personally identifiable information. So this goes back to, right, we talked about the CIA triad and mentioned privacy. Well, here's what it is. It's that confidentiality of PII. So what is PII? You need to know what these examples are. So if you see PII, personally identifiable information on the exam. Do you know what that means? Names, address, social security number. It could be a protected health information. PHI is a subset of PII. It's its own classification. Yes.
So work for insurance company,
Okay.
basically. And, you know, we do a lot of contract reviews where different trading partners have different definitions of PII.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any good examples of elements that could trip people up? Like, I mean, are there elements that people look at that and say, that's PII, that really aren't?
So the question is, are there elements that people say are PII that really aren't? You know, really what you're looking at, and that's the thing, PII is pretty broad, right? It's anything that you could use to identify an individual. That could be an email address. That could be a street address.
I was gonna say at the bank, it's anything that's not public. So if you can find it in the phone book, if you can.
That's a good definition.
So,
yeah, anything that's not public. So if you could find it in the phone book or a publicly published document, it would not be considered PII.
Or in some cases, it's the regs that you're under in
Mhm.
the higher education environment, FERPA.
Yep.
It defines certain types of PII would really be called directory information. But then there still has to be a way for people to opt out of the directory. But so
Yeah.
it really is going to depend on the industry you're in.
Yeah, so the comment was it's really going to depend on the industry, you know, what regulations you're under. For the purposes of the exam, you just need to know that it is information that could identify an individual. Okay, so when you see it, you need to be able to say, oh, that's PII, right? So if it's a name, an email address, again, social security number, bank account information. So maybe you have, maybe not just the bank number, but if you had two pieces of it together, that then be a name and a bank number, or a street address and a bank number. Something that combination would then make it personally identifiable. Again, we don't, the thing to remember with the CISSP is it is kind of agnostic of those, right? We're keeping it at a high level within the CISSP. They're not going to say, what does GDPR classify PII as? What is HIPAA? What is, you know, FERPA? We just need to know the concept for it. And again, there are numerous privacy laws throughout the world. GDPR really is going to, looks like it's going to kind of redefine what is PII for European. And I think it's going to lead a lot of people down there, around the world down that road, because you're going to have to comply with it. So that I will make sure this is in the book right now. European Union privacy. Overall, very important, right? Aggressively pro-privacy law. You have to notify individuals how their data is gathered and used. You have to allow for opt-out for sharing with third parties and opt-in for sharing sensitive information or sensitive data. That's being replaced by GDPR. So for what's on the exam, they haven't come out with a new CBK yet. That's coming out here this month, a couple of days, I guess. So I'm not sure what that's going to look like and if it's going to reference GDPR or the EU privacy, but very similar, and we'll need to know that. So that's something we're going to have to keep an eye on as the GDPR gets rolled out, and we're going to look at, you know, the new CBK when that comes out and how it addresses it.
How is that audited?
What do you mean?
If we're working with an organization that has to comply to it, how do you ensure that you know about all of the things that they're gathering, and then you can audit that they're sharing it back out, you know, with their constituents?
Yeah, how do you audit it? There are, yeah,
No, that's fair.
yeah. So there are some things out there where, you know, with GDPR, you'll have to register as a data processor or data controller. That having a third-party audit that somebody's come in and said, we've gone through what the requirements are and verified it. Yeah, so if you're using it, a company that says they're compliant, you better do your due diligence. Have you done a vendor risk assessment? Show me how you're proving you're GDPR compliant. This is not mandatory, but you need to know Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. There's privacy guidelines. There are 8 8 driving principles for this. We want to collect limitation. We want to make sure we have quality data. We're not collecting garbage. It has to be purpose specific. So we're not just collecting everything. If we're collecting it, there is a reason for it. We're not just collecting everything we can and vacuuming up as much data as we can. We're only collecting data for a specific purpose. Use limitation, again, so the data we have is only going to be used in a specific manner. We're not going to just, once we have it, use it however we want. What security safeguards do we have in place? We're going to be open. Transparency is it is very important. Individual participation, don't remember what that one's for. And then we have accountability. Again, these are optional. You don't necessarily need to know all the information about what each of these do. You just need to know those 8 principles for it. So EU-US safe harbor. This is for US companies that are not compliant with the EU privacy practices. Okay. So it's going to give those US-based organizations the ability to have that transfer. Unfortunately, that is being replaced by GDPR effective May 25th. So we'll have to see again what the new CBK, how that handles GDPR. I assume it will, in that it's been published for quite a while, but we'll see how that actually handles it. What you may get from this is read and understand GDPR. So once we get a copy of that, there'll probably be an update to this. If it's on the CBK, the common body of knowledge, it will be on. It's open. It's fair game for the test. So we'll see what that comes. It may say you still have to have certain things as well as GDPR. I just don't know at this point what it's going to have. Other rules that we need to know: HIPAA, right? It's the Department of Health and Human Services, DHS, and the Office for Civil Rights. So the OCR is who actually does the auditing and compliance checks against HIPAA. We need to know the 3 rules: privacy, security, and breach notification rules. Those are the 3 things we need to understand. This applies to any covered entity, so hospitals, doctors' offices, pharmacies, and then business associates. So if you need to understand, if you're housing or working with PHI with a covered entity, you probably sign a business associate agreement, which means you are now beholden to HIPAA. So same requirements as the actual hospital. So you need to know, passed in 96, the security rule finalized in 2003, high tech was in 2009, and omnibus rule in 2013. Just remember those dates, right? It was originally passed in 96, security rule 2003, the high tech act 2009, and then the omnibus rule in 2013. A lot of memorization from this, a lot of just repetition to remember these things. Security rule, gosh, administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. Where have we seen that before? Right? That's what we're looking at. Yes?
Do we have to know what each rule did, or just the dates that they happened?
I think just the dates that they happen. As you read through them, it's pretty straightforward when you actually see, right? The original rule, the security rule is pretty clear. High tech was the update for the technical piece of it, and then the omnibus rule was the most recent update. Yeah. Once you read through them, and I think there's a little more detail in the book itself. It's pretty easy from a technology perspective. As those dates go up, they become more relevant. And you have to do a risk analysis, right? What we're seeing is, everyone's the wall of shame, all the breaches. You no longer see that low end, well, we didn't know about it, so we're going to get fined the lowest amount because we just didn't know this happened. It's no longer acceptable. If you haven't done a risk assessment, you don't know what your risks are, ignorance is no longer a valid defense. Couple other rules: Electronic Communications Privacy Act, so that's going to protect you against warrantless wiretapping. That was kind of overwritten by the Patriot Act, but you'll need to know that ECPA was to protect against warrantless wiretapping. So they have, if they want to tap your cell phone, you have to get a warrant first. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, You know, it's Title 18, Section 1030. This is what is used to prosecute computer crimes. It was enacted in 1986. Things haven't changed too much since 86, right? Unfortunately, it has been amended a bunch of times. I think you probably want to know Patriot Act and Identity Theft Enforcement and Restitution Act. But even then, the latest amendment has been 10 years at this point, right? What's the rule? About every 2 years, technology capacity doubles, things speed up, right? So we're prosecuting on technology at this point. It's 10 years old. It's not, or in some cases, 30 years old. But you need to know it and understand those dates. All right, Patriot Act, we need to know that. Patriot Act of 2001. This was an expansion of law enforcement's ability to do electronic monitoring, right? So allowing that search and seizure without immediate disclosure. Those are the two kind of points that you want to know on that. We have GLBA. This is financial institutions by the FFIEC, the Financial Institution Examination Council, and then the member agency. So this is going to be, banks, right? So you have the FFIEC overseeing, you have the OCC, they're FDIC insured, right? The credit unions, Consumer Financial Protection Board. This was in 99, and GLBA 99 for financial institutions require confidentiality and integrity of that, protection of confidentiality and integrity of the consumer financial information. Availability isn't there, right? It's hard to make that a requirement, but we want to make sure that it's protected. Only those people that need to have access can have access, and what they have is valid. It hasn't been modified. More laws. Everybody's so excited about laws, right? We need to know California Senate Bill 1386. This is for regulating privacy of personal information. This is, again, why this is important. It's that second bullet. This is one of the first data breach notification laws. If that data was breached, California was one of the first to say, here's what you have to do. You have a legal requirement to notify those that have been affected. Sarbanes-Oxley of 2002. This comes back to those financial scandals. So it was at Enron and what was the accounting firm? Whatever that was. It's regulatory compliance for financial reporting. So you can't cook the books, right? That's what they're trying to prevent.
Anderson Consulting.
Anderson Consulting, thank you. Which is now something else. They didn't go anywhere. They changed their name. Intentional violations can result in criminal penalties. Look at Enron, right? There was jail time and prison time associated with the cooking the books and doing that. We have more rules and laws. We're almost done with rules and laws. PCI DSS, payment card industry. We need to know really what you want to look at. This is related to credit cards. This is run by the credit card agencies, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, right? American Express is part of that, I think. Credit and debit, it's not a governmental regulation. It's not a law. This is self-policing, right? They created it because the government said, hey, we've got a lot of problems going on here. We're going to have to regulate this. And they said, oh, we'll do it ourselves. Created PCI DSS. So you have to have a set of minimum security requirements, and it really does require that annual audit, and it's pretty in depth. Yeah, here's our security joke. What does PCI stand for? Pay cash instead. Come on, it's not that late, guys. Come on. I can hear the groaning through the computer of everyone online.
There's a boo.
All right, more laws and regulatory issues. Breach notification laws. It was 47 last year, 48 now. New Mexico is the newest one.
Actually, I just checked it online. It's in all 50 states and territories, major U.S. territories have breach notification laws now.
Man, they're ahead of us. That must have just changed very recently. I know. Darn it, Evan. He's going to hear this. I don't know if he's online or not. He's going to be back next week. I'm just not going to hear the end of it. Nobody tell him when he's back. There is no federal breach notification law. This is a problem, right? Because now you've got conflicts between what the different states, who am I beholden to? Is it where the resident is, where the data is? Reality is it's where it's going to be where the person resides, regardless of where the data is in that case, right? So if you have data on California residents, you need to understand that they're going to sue under a California data breach notification. Safe harbor may not, depends if data was encrypted, depending on the state. There was a big brouhaha with Tennessee's, right, saying it doesn't matter if it's encrypted or not, you have to notify. I said, well, then I'm not going to encrypt it. Why am I going to go through the hassle and difficulty of applying encryption if I have to notify regardless? I believe that got overturned. They kind of came to their senses on that one because, the kind of that pushback was like, really? Well, what's the point, right? So make data protection laws, numerous data destruction laws. We have to understand how we can properly protect and destroy data. And then we have to understand what the Freedom of Information Act considers. So before we can destroy data, do we fall under a Freedom of Information Act? Schools, right? Colleges, state colleges, public schools, government agencies. You can't just destroy that data. You do have to make sure you're complying with the Freedom of Information Act requirements. All right. We need to know vendor risk management. This is a big one. How are we attesting? How are you attesting to the fact that vendors are protecting assets adequately? We're going to do risk assessments against our vendors. Are we going to assess like the FISA, right? I'll do a shameless self-plug. VEN Defense, VEN Defense. That is ours. Just rolled out. You can go there, vendefense.com. Are you happy, Andy? He was giving me grief about calling him out. I like it. Andy's a good guy. So there's a SOC 2, Type 1, Type 2. You don't necessarily need to know the difference. Difference being so SOC 2, you're looking at attesting to the controls you have in place. You're going to scope and say, my data center is SOC 2 compliant. A Type 1 is a point in time. When we came in and did the attestation, they were meeting all the requirements. A Type 2 is over a period of time. You can typically either a 6 or a 12-month period. They'll come back every 6 months, come back once a year, and look at the previous 6 or 12 months worth of data. Take a sample of that and ensure that you are continuing that ongoing piece of ongoing compliance.
Andy wants to thank you, and someone has a question about the SAE or SSAE 18.
So that would be, out of your, that's a report out of the SOC, right? That's going to say, here is what was in scope. Here are the controls we looked at. Here are the results of that, and give you that information. So that's what you're going to look at and interpret and understand if what they have had in scope actually meets what you're using them for. That's one of the downsides of a SOC 2 or an ISO certification is it is scoped to a specific piece or functionality. So you just need to make sure if you're looking at an organization for a specific product or service and they give you a SOC 2, that it is scoped appropriately, right? You're going to use them for colo hosting, and their SOC 2 is for a web-based cloud application, right? It's not the same thing. So just something to keep in mind when you're looking at that. Same with the ISO certification. Going through an independent attestation of the controls are in place, they have a security program in place, and they're doing what they say they're doing and protect the data. High trust is another one for healthcare. And then PCI DSS ROC. So if you're using a company for your PCI, for your card processing, you'd want to see their PCI ROC that shows here's what's in scope and that they have all those controls in place. We want to maintain the right to pen test and right to audit, right? Doesn't mean we're going to do it, but we want to maintain that ability. So if there is an issue, we can come in and say, hey, we looked at your SOC 2 and you said you were doing pen testing, but you can't produce any reports to show me that you've had this done. We have the right at our expense to perform a pen test against you. We're going to go ahead and take advantage of that right. It is very common in contracts. So you just want to, when you're looking at it, make sure that that's still in the contract. Same thing with right to audit. We need to understand how procurement, acquisitions, and divestitures are handled as well. But really, when it comes to vendor risk management, it really comes down to due care, due diligence, right? Due care is making sure you're doing it, doing the right thing. What prudent man is, due diligence is management of due care. All right. The IC squared code of ethics, you have got to know this, okay? If you can't recite this in your sleep, you don't know it well enough yet, because they will test you on this. You have to agree to it to become a CISSP. You need to know there's the preamble, the canons, those are the mandatory piece, and then there's guidance, which is advisory. So there's the 4 canons. You have to protect society, the Commonwealth, and the infrastructure. Act honorably, honestly, and justly, responsibly, and legally. Provide diligent and competent service to principals, and advance and protect the profession. These are applied in order. What will happen in the exam is you will be given a scenario and say which canon applies to that. And you need to know the order, right? And now maybe you'll have 2 of the 4, and there'll be 2 that are just not at all related to this. You need to be able to know these 4 so you can knock those 2 off and know I don't have to worry about those. Those are wrong. Those are not part of the canons. Now do I know, is it protect society or is it provide diligent and competent services? Which one is the higher of the 2?
I noticed how you had to read those off there.
I memorized them for the exam. I wanted to make sure I didn't mess it up. I've had enough issues. Another little trick for the exam, when you're doing this, if the answer is protect human life, that is always the correct answer. So if you see, the fire alarm has gone off and you have to figure out what's going on, and the 4 answers, and one of them is do this to protect human life, that is always going to be the correct answer. So that's a gimme if you see that on there. Or at least it used to be. Maybe they changed it. I can't imagine they did. I don't plan on retaking the exam. I'm going to maintain my CPEs. Computer Ethics Institute has 10 commandments. We do need to know this. Shall not use a computer to harm other people, right? So we're going to act. It kind of really goes back to the canon of the CISSP too, right? Act honorably, not interfere with other people's computer work, snoop around in other people's computer files. Eric.
I'm out.
You are an ethical hacker.
Oh, okay.
You have gotten approval and permission before doing it. You're not going to use a computer to steal, not use a computer to bear false witness. Yeah, you need to know. You'll need to know the 10 commandments of computer ethics. We'll get this out as a PDF. And while I'm saying that, did everybody get a download or an email about the link for the PDF for the first one? Okay, we'll make sure that those are either sent out or as handouts and attachments available for the next session. Make sure everybody gets those. Again, shall not copy or use proprietary software for which you do not pay. So we're not going to pirate software. Kind of common sense on these, especially given everything else we've already gone through. We're not going to use other people's resources without authorization or compensation. So that's maybe that's some of that Bitcoin mining that's going on with browsers and web browsers. Does that really hit and comply with the computer ethics 10 commandments? I would argue no, but you're not going to appropriate other people's intellectual output. Thou shalt think about the social consequences of the program you are writing or the system you are designing, and shall always use a computer in ways that ensure consideration and respect for your fellow humans. So you do need to know the 10 commandments. That is not my decision to make on that interpretation. I have my opinions, and that is a different story. The 10 commandments of this, so it's ethics in the internet. we need to know it's RFC 1087. So again, if you see that RFC or any of those dates, we do need to know. Really, the important part is that the 10 Commandments of Computer Ethics is RFC 1087, and that was published in 1987. It is what is considered unethical behavior. We need to know that, right? All right. We're doing pretty good. We're flying through this. Any other questions online? Anything that's come up?
No.
All right. All right. So we need to have security governance, information security governance. So this is going to be your security policies and any related documents that support it. Right. So we have a policy that is the what should we be doing? Right. This is going to be your high level. And we need to have in a policy. This is going to be a mandatory thing. We have a purpose. What is the purpose of this document? What are we accomplishing with it? What is the scope of it? What are the responsibilities associated with this, and how do we manage compliance? So, maybe we have what's a good easy one here? A backup policy, right? Well, what's the purpose of this? This is going to define how backups and restoration are handled. What's the scope? Well, any system that is being backed up and anybody who is managing backups. Responsibility. So, the backup operator will make sure that this happens and do X, Y, and Z. We're going to have to define those responsibilities. Policies are, by nature, they should be kept at a high level, right? These are formal documents. These are things that are going to be, updated on an annual basis. We don't want to be constantly updating policies. And then for compliance, what happens if somebody is not in compliance with the policy? What is the sanctions for not being in compliance? How are we going to verify people are in compliance? We can have 3 different policy types: program policy, issue-specific policy, and system-specific policy. It's kind of high level, right? We have our information security policy. That is a program policy, right? This is a high level covering that program, right? Issue specific, so that would be backup, employee screening, encryption. System specific, you could have something that says wireless networking kind of is specific to your wireless network, right? It's very specific to it. So we just need to understand policies are mandatory and that they have those 4 pieces to them.
I haven't seen the next slide. You might be getting to it, but the question is define the difference between policy and standard.
We're getting there. Good question. Hey, look at that. You were on top of it. So procedures, those are, again, mandatory. This is step-by-step guidance. Like what we set policies that saying, here's what we should be doing. Procedures are saying, here's how we're doing it. Standards are mandatory, saying the specific use of that technology. So our standard hardware is a Dell Latitude E5570. Our build standard for the server is Server 2016 with, whatever that is in there. If we need new server hardware, if we get a new server, it's going to be this model with these specifications, right? So that's going to give a specific use of a technology. The procedures are going to be that step-by-step deployment or how you perform that activity. It could rely on a standard, right? If you've got, here's our procedure for a new server deployment. It's going to go back and call to that standard that says, here's our server built. When you do this, we're going to deploy the OS and configure it according to the new server standard, right? Or the server hardening standard. A guideline is recommendation discretionary, right? It's a very high level, maybe a remote user guidelines, right? We can't really enforce that. What we want to do is say, hey, if you're going to be working remotely, here's some best practices. Here's the things you should be doing. And then baselines and benchmarks. These are discretionary. It's a uniform method of implementing a standard. So we've got, maybe we're doing virtual machines. So we do a VM template. That is our baseline, right? And then we deploy it and do take that deployment standard, or we take a procedure, we're going to say our new server deployment. We're going to use our baseline template to deploy it, and then follow the procedure to say, okay, we're renaming it, we're putting this version of the endpoint protection on it, we're doing this with the firewall configuration, here's how we IP it, here's how we configure the VLAN, all those step-by-step pieces that you need to actually put it in place. That answer that question?
Yep.
Okay. Yes.
Where would a process fit into this?
That would be really under that procedure. So like, yeah, it would be process and procedures are kind of interchangeable for that. All right. Any questions on this? You do need to know that. So policy, high level, what should we be doing? Procedures, here's how we're doing it. Standards are, here's the technology that we're going to use to implement it and do those 2 steps above it. Guidelines are discretionary, very high level, and then the baseline is here's the where we're starting at. We can compare back to against it. Right?
I think you just stated the answer.
Okay. So access control, defensive categories and types. So personnel security considerations. We need to have security awareness and training. It is not security awareness training, it's security awareness and training, right? 2 different things. Training teaches that specific skill. Awareness activities are reminders, right? So we come in and speak and say, annual security training. Here's all the things you have to look out for. Here's how to spot spam. The awareness might be that know before training spam or whatever system or service you're using. Or the awareness would be posters up that say, hey, keep in mind, whatever you're looking for, whatever the latest that month's theme for your security program would be. We need to do background checks. So whatever is appropriate and legal, okay, that's important. Whatever is appropriate and legal. More sensitive roles will require more thorough checks. So when you're hiring somebody, are you doing appropriate checks? If you're hiring somebody into finance, you do probably want to look at a criminal background check, do a credit check. And you're hiring somebody to work in the warehouse and it's, they don't have access to anything, maybe you're just doing a criminal background check. So you want to make sure that the background checks you do are appropriate to the role and responsibility. And that doesn't mean it's just a one-time, it could be an ongoing check. So maybe maybe Brittany starts as, the front desk receptionist and then moves into accounting or finance. Well, at the front desk, you don't have as much access to that sensitive information. So maybe you just do a background check. When she's going to get that promotion into a more sensitive area, so finance, right, corporate finance or payroll, whatever it is, now maybe we're going to say, you know what, we're going to do a credit check against you as well and make sure that there's nothing that throws up any red flags. How are we handling employee termination? We need to have a formalized disciplinary process. So we can't just say, hey, one and done, right? What is the sanction policy? There's a written warning, or a verbal warning, written warning, and then termination, right? Or verbal warning, written warning, performance improvement plan, and if you don't meet it, then termination. But we need to have that documented and understand what that is, and it should be progressive. So for each violation, it gets more severe. Now, obviously, there are going to be some violations that go immediately to termination. Want to make sure when we're doing employee termination that we do cover exit interviews, right, revocation, account reviews, et cetera. So what we're looking at here is when somebody comes on, you have a process, right? Hey, the request comes in from HR, the manager says these are what this person needs access to, whatever that is. At the same time, when there's a termination, we need to have a process for it. IT is alerted by HR when this happens. And when IT gets that alert, they're going to document what groups they were in, remove them from these groups, deactivate the account, whatever it is. But we need to have that formal process in place. We need to know how are we dealing with our vendors, contractors, and third parties. Again, when we're looking at these vendors, contractors, third parties, Are they performing background checks? Is it in your contract that they are going to perform background checks that are appropriate for the position that they are providing? It's an important thing to know, right? If you've got a janitorial service that they're after hours and they're not doing any background checks, and somebody's got really bad credit and they're got bad bills, and the inclination would be they're going to have access to everything in the organization. They'd be easier to potentially compromise. So we want to make sure that our vendors, third parties, are doing those same levels as you would for an employee. And then how are we going to handle outsourcing and offshoring and having that documented? Everybody having fun? This is the long chapter. There's been a lot of information. So we've got categories, again, administrative controls, technical controls, physical controls. We need to know, right? It says you may be given a scenario control description and you need to provide the category and type. So this will be kind of a test question. Here is the scenario. Is this an administrative, technical, or physical control? And is it preventative, detective, corrective? So we look at this, we could say somebody is, so what would you consider a security guard, right? Well, is that an administrative, a technical, or a physical control? That would be a physical control. It's a physical person there. Is it preventative, detective, corrective, recovery, deterrent, or compensating? Preventative, detective, and deterrent, right? It depends on the scenario, right? So that's where you got to be careful, because you got to read the scenario and understand and say, the company had a lot of break-ins, so they've hired a security guard to sit in a van by the front gate because people were breaking into the front gate. Well, then it'd be that'd be more of a deterrent, right? There's somebody there, they're there to deter them from happening. Same thing, cameras, that's another one. Is that a preventative, detective, corrective, recovery, deterrent, or compensating control? Depends on the scenario, right? Do you put a camera in place so that's obvious to deter those people from maybe doing that behavior to start with? No, then in that case, it's a deterrent control. Detective, it's kind of hidden to watch what's going on and be able to go back and look later and see what happened. Now it's a detective control. So you'll be given a scenario. You need to know what the difference is between an administrative, a technical, and a physical control, and then what type of control it is. So administrative control, that could be, that's more the documentation side of things, right? Policy, procedures, sanctions policy, security awareness and training, right? So administrative is more documentation, people side of it. Technical, endpoint protection, firewalls, servers, a technical solution. And physical is, typically something you can touch, right? A security guard, cipher lock, cameras, badge system, things like that.
Don't recommend touching security guards, though.
Yeah, it becomes a corrective control at that. Okay, so you are going to need to study and understand the different different categories, different types, and understand that a control could fall under multiple types, and you're going to need to read the scenario and interpret what is the appropriate type that it would fall under. Any questions about that online?
The question is a camera a technical or a physical control? And I thought you answered it, but
yeah,
the response is not really. So
I would say it is a physical control. The DVR system could be more that technical back end piece, right? So the actual camera itself is a physical. It's there, physically there, right? It could be technical. Again, really is going to come down to what the scenario says, right? You've installed a camera because there's been a lot of loitering. Well, maybe in that case it's a physical, it's there and it's a deterrent, versus at the airport they're putting the cameras in for with facial recognition, looking for, potential wanted, people, and it's more of a technical and detective control, right?
Would it be fair to say that technical controls are more logical in nature?
Yeah, I guess that would be fair. So technical controls could be more logical in nature. All right, almost done. Right? All right, so already. Risk analysis. We need to understand, I think the box will start with this. This is Evans. Risk is arguably the most overused and misunderstood concept in security. Evan does disagree with the book, and I would actually agree. Risk is the likelihood of something bad happening and the impact if it did. So that's how we were going to define risk. Decisions should be driven by risk. One of the things that is true, most people don't assess risk well, right? So when you look at it, we're looking at what is the likelihood of something happening and the impact if it did. People don't assess that by nature. That is not something that is kind of instinctual to do well. Train yourself on it.
Always underestimate. Okay.
Yeah, always underestimate. Yep.
Grossly.
Yeah, grossly. Yeah. To do a risk analysis, we need to know what our assets are. We have to have an asset inventory. And so we can't do a risk analysis if we don't know what are we comparing the risk to. What are all of our threats? What are all of our vulnerabilities? So the vulnerability is the weakness. The threat would be what's going to happen. So Eric is the threat to the web server. Right? So we need to understand what a threat is, what are the vulnerabilities. We have to identify all the threats, all the vulnerabilities for all of our assets. Risk is the threat times the vulnerability. So again, the likelihood of something happening, the threat, and the impact if it did. So you can see the bottom part there. The book says risk is threat times the vulnerability. The better would be the threat times the vulnerability times the impact. So if you know risk is threat times the vulnerability, and then say, I'm going to go the extra step and include impact, the test isn't going to include that, but that's Evan's personal tip. And I would agree it's much more accurate that way. All right. Risk calculations. We need to understand how to do that. A risk analysis matrix that you see there. So what is the likelihood or the impact that it will happen? And the likelihood, it will, most likely, it's possible, it's unlikely, or it's rare. That's your likelihoods. And then your impacts. So there's nearly no impact if this happens, or there's a minor impact, moderate, major, disaster. And how we determine low, medium, high, and extreme is we're saying the likelihood that this will happen. So thunderstorms, well, it's going to happen, right? It's extremely likely. This is going to happen. What's the impact of the thunderstorm? There's nearly no impact, or maybe it's a minor impact, right? Probably nearly no. You'd have to have a direct lightning strike really to cause an issue. So maybe we say it's a nearly no. Or ransomware. What is the likelihood of ransomware happening? It's possible, or is it most likely? Well, as an organization, you need to make these determinations and understand maybe the ransomware on your servers is on a core system that's really restricted, has good access controls, is segmented. That one, maybe it's unlikely. On a user workstation, it's most likely. Well, what's the impact to it? So on a user workstation, it'd be most likely, but it's a minor impact, right? It's just an inconvenience for that user versus it's unlikely, but it's a disaster if it hits your server. So in the first example, it's a most likely, and a minor, it's a medium risk, versus on a server, it's unlikely, but if it happens, it's a disaster. Now it's a high risk. Everyone get how that works? All right. There's a ton of risk analysis matrices out there, so find one that works for you and use it. Annualized loss expectancy, you need to know this. Wow, he didn't put, oh, he did put him on. Okay, good. I remember him, but I was gonna say, wow, he's not putting them on there. Annualized risk loss expectancies. You need to know these formulas. It's the annualized loss expectancy is the single loss expectancy times the average rate of return or annual rate of occurrence. So what is, to find our annualized loss expectancy, we need to know what is the loss if it happens once, and what is the rate or the rate of occurrence. So to get, for an example, we have a system that if it goes down, it's going to cost us $5,000, and it goes down 4 times a year. Well, now our annualized loss expectancy is $20,000. Now we can go back and say, hey, to prevent this from going down, we can buy a new server because it's out of date and unsupported. The new server is going to cost $15,000. Right now we can say, oh, okay, now we're in good shape. Or we determine that annualized loss expectancy and the solution is $25,000 for a $20,000 annualized loss expectancy, it's no longer worth it. We're going to accept that risk. It's going to cost more than the risk and the annualized loss expectancy. So we need to know our asset to figure out that single loss expectancy. We need to know our asset value. How do we determine that? There's a couple different approaches: market approach, income approach, cost approach. So we need to know, how are we determining what our asset value is? I don't believe you need to know. I don't remember getting tested on that, just on the actual formulas and knowing what that is, but to do it appropriately. Is it a web server that goes down, and if it's down for every hour that it's down costs us X amount of money? It's $1,000 an hour, and it's down for 20 hours a year. Now we're at an annualized loss expectancy of $20,000, right? So we just need to know what that asset value is, regardless of the approach that's taken. What is our exposure factor? So that's the percent of an asset exposed given the threat and vulnerability. So a single loss expectancy would be the value versus the percent of that asset exposed. So, man, it's getting late. I just
Denial of service.
Yeah.
Clusters,
thank you.
and they will take it completely offline, but now you can only handle half as many connections as you normally would. 50%.
So yeah, that'd be a good one, like a web server that gets a denial of service. So you, instead of having it fully down, it's at half capacity. Thank you.
Question is, how do you calculate EF?
The exposure factor.
Yeah.
So yeah, you'll say, right, it could be that you've got a web server that it could be a percentage of that availability for that single loss. So maybe it goes down in a cluster, or one of the two goes down, so now you're at half capacity.
They give you the data points enough on the questions, right?
Yeah, you should. Yeah, again, really what you're going to want, again, you don't necessarily need to know for that. I think that what I remember from the exam is the formulas. You've got to know. So they'll say, what is the annualized loss expectancy of this, given that the annual rate of, or the annual rate of occurrence is this, and they'll give you the SLE, or they'll give you all the data points, and you have to kind of work your way back using those formulas. Yes, hold on.
Could you repeat the market approach?
Yeah, so what is the market value, and what's the loss of income? And then, and what's the cost, that would be, what's the cost to replace, right?
Cost to replace versus actual
Market value, yeah. Yes.
Is there scratch paper during the test?
They will give you like a little whiteboard.
Oh, okay.
Or paper. It depends on what the one I used had a little like whiteboard with a dry erase.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. And we'll go through some of that stuff at the very end with like tips and tricks. Is if you've got formulas that you're really struggling with, when you get in there, like write them down immediately. Cram in the last minute and write those down so you don't forget them. But yeah, when you get to the test, they're gonna say, they'll give you all the data points, and that's why you need to know those formulas to be able to work through and get the correct answer. So you don't necessarily need to know, how do I determine the exposure factor? They're gonna give you an exposure factor and a asset value and the annual rate of occurrence, and say, figure out my annualized loss expectancy. They don't make it quite that clear. There's gonna be a lot of stuff you're gonna have to read through and interpret, right? It's not gonna be like, given the exposure factor of this and a value of this with an occurrence of this, what is the rate of average annualized loss expectancy, right? They're going to put it into a giant paragraph that you have to parse and figure out. And a lot of times the top half of it is completely irrelevant, or the bottom half. So you got to pay attention. Don't make an assumption. Read that question very carefully. But all the information you do need will be in there, assuming you know how to figure these out.
I have a threat question. Do they differentiate between known unknown, and unknown unknown?
I do not remember that being the case. No, I think they're going to give you just need to know what a threat is and how to figure out the risk. Right. So they'll give you again a paragraph and say what is the risk given this and using the matrix. They'll provide all the information you need to figure that out. All right. Risk analysis, we need to know a total cost of ownership. So that's that cost of implementing the safeguards or controls. We need to have budget and metrics. We can't manage what we can't measure. And then we need to understand what the risk choices are. And the top one is one that a lot of people kind of seem to struggle with, but you can accept risk, right? When would we accept the risk? Yeah. So they'll say, here's the scenario. If this happens, the impact would be $20,000. They identify these solutions and pick the one that's going to cost $30,000 to implement. Which risk action should they take? Accept, mitigate, transfer, or avoid. You need to be able to pick the correct one given that information, knowing we're going to accept the risk if the cost to solve or mitigate it is higher than the actual risk poses.
Is the cost always in dollars, or can the cost be put in, say, reputation?
For this, it's always in dollars on the test that I remember, right? They're going to say, here's our reputational impact, which could cause the loss of, and put a dollar amount to it.
If they talk about qualitative analysis, that might come in the loss of reputation.
One more slide. Man, you guys are on top of it. So again, mitigate the risk, right? Put something in place to mitigate that risk. We have a risk of people not knowing who goes into the data center because it's protected by a physical key. Maybe we'll put cameras or a badge system in place. Yes?
What's ROSI?
Return on security investment. I hope that's what it is. That's what comes to mind. Are we going to transfer the risk? That would be cyber insurance, or maybe we're going to output it to a cloud, right? We're transferring the risk to the cloud provider, and then we're going to avoid the risk. We're just not going to do that, right? BYOD would be is probably the most common one. The risk of a BYOD device, we're not going to do BYOD. It's too risky. Hey, qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis. We do need to know the difference between the two. And I'll show you, it's in the book. I pulled it out of the book because it's how I remembered it, and it's really good. But risk management NIST 830. Risk management NIST 830. Okay, everybody got it? You're gonna need to know risk management NIST 830. It's a 9-step process. So what are we gonna do for risk management? We need to characterize the system, right? That's our asset inventory. What's our threats? What are our vulnerabilities? We're going to do a control analysis against those vulnerabilities. We're going to do a likelihood determination. What is the likelihood of this happening? What is the impact of this happening? We'll then determine what the risk is to it, to that asset. We're going to make our control recommendations and then document the results. So we're going to do our asset inventory. We're going to do all of our threats. We're going to list those out. We're going to list out all of our vulnerabilities. We'll do an analysis and say what are those, do a control against it. Determine what the likelihood of each of those scenarios is. What is the impact of each of those? Making our risk determination. It's everything we just talked about, right? NIST 830 is where that came from. And then really important, we do need to document the results. You can't do all this and not document it and then expect people to believe you've done it. Plus, I can't imagine you going through all the first 8 steps not to document it and get credit. So how do we tell the difference between qualitative risk analysis and quantitative? Quantitative is calculating the quantity of the asset you're protected. So remember, quantitative is quantity. Qualitative is going to be more of a subjective. So that's where your reputational risk is going to be more of a subjective piece rather than a hard dollar amount. Does that make sense? All right. Types of attackers. We've got hackers. So you got black hat hacker, malicious. So what is a black hat hacker? Those are people that are going to be doing this without authorization. We have white hat or ethical hackers, as Eric takes off his black hat. White hat, or these are ethical PID testers. These are people that are doing this, looking and alerting companies of bugs, doing the bug bounty programs, doing penetration tests for companies they've been hired to test their controls against. Gray hat, where maybe they start out as white hat and turn around and sell it for a quick buck, right? They kind of go back and forth. Maybe they find something against Facebook. They don't like Facebook. They'll sell that on the black market. They find something against another product that they like and agree with. They'll go to that company and tell them, and hey, I found this, and give them a chance to correct it. So they kind of float back and forth.
I think there was another example of that recently. It came out last year. I forget if it was Guidant or whoever had manufactured the heart monitors that could be
the Bluetooth or
into, right. Well, the person released that information to the public so that the company would fix it immediately, because if they didn't release it to the public, it could get wrapped. They could get wrapped up in legalese and not be able to say anything, and yet that risk is still out there to the greater public.
Yeah, so yeah, you see that a lot where they publish a vulnerability to a company that doesn't do anything. Panera.
Right. That would have been a great example to do it.
And then they come out and then publish it to the public because it hasn't. They tried to go the right route. Nothing happened.
That'd be kind of like under hacktivism then.
Yeah, I think I would kind of. Well, no.
Who's asking?
Yeah. There's some kind of wiggle room in there, right? This is not black and white, even though it says black, white, and gray. Some of these other ones are a little bit more shades of gray. So we got the hackers, script kiddies, right? They're just, hey, I found this DDoS tool and I'm downloading it and running it. Don't really know what they're doing. They're just using click and play type of thing. Outsider versus insider. A lot of the risk and a lot of the breaches, a lot of time it's insider threat, right? So is it on the outside? Is it in the inside? A hacktivist, that would be more like maybe defacing a website, to get their message across. Bots, botnets, right? Everybody's heard of bots and botnets. We just need to know what those are. Phishers and spear phishers. So phishing is that wide net. Spear phishing is more targeted attack. Visher is voice calls, trying to phish people via voice call. Whalers or whaling, that's when you're going after that high value target in an organization. So the executive C-level type people. Guess what? That's it. All right.
Question, do
Yes.
they ask any questions regarding countermeasures? Mitigate the insider threats or the outside?
I don't remember. I think if they do, it's going to be in a scenario where it's going to be, here's the threat and here's the solution, and what do you go with? Based more on that risk analysis methodology. I don't remember them saying a specific solution. Or they're very agnostic and try to stay agnostic on this stuff because it's worldwide, right? So that was it. That's a lot. We went through it at a high level. Read through the book. Read chapter 2. Reread it again now that we've talked through it and you've got an idea of what to really focus on. Any questions on chapter 2? Come with those for Tuesday. We're going to recap some of this because, again, we went through a lot. And we'll cover some of those questions. We'll do a quiz. Sorry to say, you guys are off the hook. Evan will be back on Tuesday, so you'll get to listen to him talk instead of me. I know you're all disappointed. I can see it in your faces. And then next next class, next Thursday, I should say, is our first break. So that'll give you a chance to kind of catch up because we're going through a whole lot of information. We had an online question.
There was a question that they asked earlier with regard to before you end, do you know where the PDF of the book might be found?
PDF, I think we got it from, is in the first slide deck. We had some of the resources. You can get it on Amazon as a Kindle version, or Seizure is where the version I have is purchased through. ELESEIVER, I believe, but it was it's on one of the slides in the first slide deck.
Amazon has a Kindle version.
Yeah, I do like the PDF. I'm with Evan, right? If I'm searching for something, as I was going through and kind of last minute cramming, because I was like, oh, what was some of that stuff? I could search through it. Huh?
Was that first slide that sent out?
I will verify that, Andy.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, check your clutter or junk mail. We had a bunch of people online that, hey, we didn't see it, and it was okay.
It's worth mentioning though that Kindle just updated to add a flashcard option to
Okay.
reference books, and this is considered a reference.
Okay, so comment was Kindle just upgraded to allow for a flashcard or SD card option for reference books.
No,
No.
not what I mean.
What?
Not an SD card. You can literally add flashcards.
Oh.
Text from the
Kindle
book
allows you to add flashcard notes to the book if it's a reference
by
book
highlighting.
by highlighting a section and making a note. I apologize. Thank you. I'm glad you clarified that.
So that's just
Kind of a little different. All right. Any other questions before we end?
No, everybody's saying thank you. Yeah, I think we're good.
All right. See everybody on Tuesday.
that was 800 years.